Most welcome to 1644 of the Heidegger series. Filming outside here, it's a bit chilly. There are some people celebrating around the corner. I hope that will not be too much of a disturbance. Check that my microphone is correctly inserted. I talked earlier about memory as engravings. The problem with the idea that those engravings accurately depicts memories of things past. Here Wittgenstein makes instead a comparison to somebody rehearsing something and doing something with a piece of paper and a pen. He jots down things on a piece of paper that is accompanying his recital. He needs to do this almost like a person needs to have a suit to make a lecture, proper uniform, or do something incessantly with his or her hand. A nervous twist. It is accompanying, necessary. This is not, however, a condensed or original form of the actual recital. The recital is something unrelated to it, necessary and unrelated. This can be imagined, Wittgenstein writes. It is not absolutely implausible. I would think that you can also imagine some instance of this where it's absolutely necessary to do something. At the same time, that doesn't mean that that doing has the origin of your act that accompanies it. There are quite great similarities here to perception. Our inner doesn't really have to be exactly what's inside of us. There could be differences. What Wittgenstein is looking at is our incessant need for looking for an explanation when none is needed. last read, 1643, Wittgenstein clearly tried to impress the necessity for deepening one's understanding of problems. Philosophers and philosophy has as its goal clarification, not making things harder to understand. And at last, later on in the text, page 225, start looking at the soulless tribe, and were we to think that they had souls, we would treat them differently, morally different. We would see them as sentient beings. Our attitude towards them would immediately change. Continue page 225 after the little mentioning of Norman Malcolm about the 15th line. For example, as Norman Malcolm suggests, we may no longer treat them as worn out machines when they are past work. But this argument is too quick. Although the recognition of a group of people as conscious beings may be the basis for seeing them as entitled to special treatment and as having special rights and responsibilities. Recognition of them as conscious does not eo ipso involve taking up a particular moral attitude at all. Recognition that another person is also an experiencing subject may be an acceptance of similarity, but it is not an expression of fellow feeling. The sadist is in no doubt that her victim is conscious and experiences the same pain she would if situations were reversed. But this does not stop her inflicting pain. On the contrary, the whole point of her activity is that she does not see her victim as a machine, but as a human being capable of pain and other experiences. Thus, use of the concept of the inner is completely distinct from the taking up of a moral attitude. Or the use of an ethical concept such as that of the soul. Whether one wants the notion of the inner to be the thin edge of the thin end of the wedge, or not, the idea that it might serve this function is misguided. The notion of consciousness governs our mutual interaction, but recognition of the particular grammar of the concepts relating to consciousness does not involve a commitment to any particular understanding of the human condition. I would say that is very, very something to underline, that consciousness is not a particular state or a thing, a property or any of those things. It has to do with a particular grammar of concepts relating to consciousness. And that, repeating what he said, doesn't involve a particular commitment to the human condition. It is not something that is cut in stone or is a property, henceforth unmoldable, impossible to change unrelated to all other things and isolate. To illustrate these points, it is worth considering the work of Freud, for his position challenges most of the distinctions we have made in this chapter. On the one hand, he claims that science can give us insight into our psychological concepts. Indeed, can show that they are defective and misleading. On the other, he presents a particular breakdown of the inner, which he claims is simply factually correct, take the basic notion of the unconscious. Freud treats this as a scientific discovery and claims that, contrary to what everyone had believed, not all thoughts and desires are conscious. This implies that the conventional view of the mind and of the inner in general is simply mistaken. His approach is therefore a major challenge to our existing language games. In our language game of intention, for example, the individual is given a privileged role as the person who states what her intentions are. By contrast, Freud suggests that the individual's real intentions may be hidden from her, so that what she is really trying to do may be less accessible to her than to outsiders in general, and the analyst in particular Thus, Freud's work challenges Wittgenstein's account, first by suggesting that the nature of the inner is an empirical, not a substantive issue. And second, by suggesting scientific discoveries may overturn our psychological concepts. In response to these points, the first issue to consider is the scientific nature of Freud's claims. To what extent, for example, does he follow the experimental method? In comparison with natural science, one striking point is that he rarely makes predictions, and that all his explanations are backward looking. What is more striking, however, is the disparity between the size of the generalizations he makes and the evidence on the basis of which he makes them. He claims, for example, that every dream is a wish fulfillment, or more generally still, that the key to psychology is the sexual drive, and in particular the sexual experiences of children. Given the scale of these generalizations, Freud's evidence is slender, to say the least. Furthermore, at first glance, much of his evidence actually goes against his claims. For example, many of the dreams he describes that is, anxiety dreams, would not normally be thought of as wish fulfillment dreams, and only a fair amount of ingenuity on his part succeeds in presenting them as such. In fact, the role of evidence in Freud's work seems illustrative rather than anything else. Similarly, his generalizations seem to rest on plausibility rather than exhaustive research. As an example, Wittgenstein considers Freud's remark on hallucination quote, Freud wants to say that the hallucination of anything requires tremendous energy. It is not something that could normally happen, but the energy is provided in the exceptional circumstances where a man's wish for food is overpowering. This is a speculation. It is not. It is the sort of explanation we are inclined to accept. It is not put forward as a result of detailed examination of varieties of hallucinations. Freud's argument seems to be that since an hallucination is something out of the ordinary, something out of the ordinary must have caused it. But this is not necessarily so. The claim seems to be empirical, but in fact simply describes the form which we, like Freud, would want an account of hallucination to take. as a scientific investigation. Therefore, Freud's inquiry looks rather strange. In fact, his explanations have an attraction which is totally unrelated to the evidence which support them. Supports them. What happens is that we are presented with a particular picture or way of explaining things, and the power of this picture convinces us that it must be right. Consider the parallel case of the Darwinian upheaval. In face of these relations, in face of these theories, some people accepted them enthusiastically. Others equally vehemently rejected them. And yet the evidence for them, while interesting, was hardly overwhelming. As Wittgenstein notes, the evidence is just a drop in the bucket. But there were thousands of books in which this was said to be the obvious solution. People were certain on grounds which were extremely thin. Couldn't there have been an attitude which said, "I do not know. It's an interesting hypothesis which may eventually be well confirmed"? This shows you how you can be persuaded of a certain thing. In the end, you forget entirely every question of verification. You are just sure it must have been like that. To make this point is not to say that Freud and Darwin were wrong. Rather, the aim is to highlight the fact that the attraction of their theories does not lie in their empirical basis. What makes their work so interesting is not so much that it brings to light new evidence or demonstrates particular causal relations, but rather it presents a new picture and a new way of looking at an issue. The suggestion that Freud's explanations have an appeal which goes beyond the evidence for them may seem paradoxical. For Freud himself often makes paradoxical claims. For Freud himself often makes the opposite claim, emphasizing that his explanations are disagreeable because they undermine the picture we would like to have ourselves. According to Wittgenstein, however, the very features which makes them disagreeable also give them a perverse charm. To illustrate this, consider the claim that a human being is really only a certain amount of chemical structured in a particular way. This claim seems as it were to offer a scientific meditation on mortality. In fact, it is only a provocative way of presenting the fact that we have been able to isolate the chemical components of the human body. Paradoxically, what makes some people want to present the fact in this way is its disagreeableness. Like Freud's account, the claim attacks our view of ourselves, and this gives it a certain charm. For embracing the thesis seems a testimony to our courage and intellectual rigor. The attraction of the thesis is precisely its disagreeableness, for it seems to show us overcoming our deepest prejudices. In relation to our earlier comments, one might also note that another set of claims which could be said to have this attraction is the claim that the mind can be reduced to the brain, and that human beings are essentially no different than complicated machines. To return to Freud, one way of exploring the nature of his claims in more detail is to consider his account of dreams. What he called the royal road to the unconscious. Freud treats dreams as a puzzle, both in the sense that they are the key to the state of the patient, and in that they are unexplained phenomenon that is in need of scientific inquiry. But to what extent must there be a science of dreams? Freud assumes that where there is an event, there must be a cause. But as we have already argued, and I would say quite extensively, in this area that is very much open to question. Maybe dreams just happen, or sometimes have one type of cause and sometimes another. Or maybe there's a causal explanation of the general type of dream an individual has, or of some elements of that dream, but not of every single detail. The point here is not to deny that what we dream often connects up with what we are feeling or with what is happening to us, but to question the idea that one day we will have a causal theory which will explain and predict every aspect of a dream and why it occurred at that particular time. If, however, one accepts that there may be some aspects of dreams which do not have causal explanations, one must surely also accept that quite possibly there's no single causal explanation of dreams as such. In fact, Freud was not concerned with causes in the normal scientific sense. Rather, what he wanted to do was to unravel the mystery of dreams. And develop a systematic way of interpreting them. The notion of interpretation, however, takes us away from the normal field of science. It opens up questions of meaning, not causation. For centuries, people have been explaining dreams not because they wanted to isolate their scientific cause, but because they wanted to know their significance. In fact, one of the interesting things about dreams is that even at their strangest, they do not simply strike us as nonsensical, but rather as containing a concealed message. It is to this puzzlement that Freud's explanations of dreams respond for, in place of earlier ad hoc interpretations. They offer a systematic account from this perspective. The claim that all dreams are wish fulfillments is better seen not as an ill-founded scientific generalization, but as the foundation of an interpreting system, a criterion for what is to count as an acceptable interpretation. But this does not mean that Freud's principle is arbitrary. Such a system will only be of interest if the explanations it provides justify our sense of dreams as important. specifically, they must connect the dream up with other aspects of our life in a way that is interesting or illuminating, and few would deny that Freud discovered the truth of dreams, let alone the scientific truth. To explore this point further, it is worth noting that Freud actually offers a variety of possible criteria for the correct interpretation of a dream. According to one way of looking at his work, his approach can be seen as a highly original modification and extension of our existing language games. On this approach, the subject's central and privileged role in the language game is not entirely rejected. On the contrary, just as the content of a dream is given by what the individual says she dreamt, so too her agreement is taken as crucial in interpreting the dream. Pause here. Continue in talking about Sigmund Freud and his theories, and Johnston has looked into how Freud is looking into causal explanations for our thoughts, our doings. One such original cause, he claims, is the unconscious. We look at how he builds his ideas, and there seems to be very little investigation, tryouts, seeing if these things, so to speak, fit the picture. Definitely more needs to be done. Continue. The correct interpretation is the one the individual endorses either immediately or in the course of analysis. Sometimes, however, Freud seems to be suggesting that the correct interpretation is the one the analyst gives regardless of how the patient reacts to it. This constitutes a quite different criterion for the accuracy of one interpretation over others is no longer established by the reference to the views of how the patient, use of the patient, but in terms of its relation to the interpretive canon and the professional's view of other aspects of the patient's conduct. If one asks which of these criteria is the more scientific, the answer is neither, and one could certainly imagine other approaches to dreams which could have an equal or better claim to be scientific. For example, if one defines the aim of analysis as successful treatment, one might draw up a number of interpretive frameworks and test to see which has the best effects in some objectively definable way. This would provide another means of generating dream interpretations. But one might argue that the very idea that dreams have a meaning is itself unscientific. One might argue, therefore, that the true scientific approach would seek to explain dreams by correlating them with, say, chemical activity in the brain. As far as philosophy is concerned, there's no basis for endorsing or rejecting any of these approaches. What is important is to note, first, the different types of claim they involve, and second, the fact that none of them are guaranteed to be successful in every case. Pace Freud, there may be dreams for which we can find neither an interpretation nor an explanation. To underline these points, let us consider a different example, that of intention. As noted earlier, here Freud's explanations seem to challenge our existing language games, suggesting that the basis may be misguided. Wittgenstein considers a particular example. Suppose Taylor and I are walking along the river, and Taylor stretches out his hand and pushes me in the river. When I ask why he did this, he says, "I was pointing out something to you." Whereas the psychoanalyst says that Taylor subconsciously hated me. Here we have two explanations, and it seems therefore that we must choose in between them. Wittgenstein, however, denies this, since the explanations belong to different games. They can both be right. That is, the appropriate answer within that particular game. And here comes a very important point. Each game has their own, so to speak, truth value or sense to them. This is very similar of the language game of perception, has its completely own rules, whereas the language game of talking about perceptions, communicating them, has a completely other basis. And confounding them leads to philosophical problems, or I would say error in thinking and doing. These sides are as different as can be, but the similarity in at looking at them is very compelling. Go on too quick and you are sure to mistake them for coming out of the same or being causally related and so forth. And then the problems will inevitably arise, and they will grow and grow in strength, because the further you go into the mud, as I said in penultimate lecture, the more you will want to find other solutions within that. And that doing is like moving in the quicksand. It will draw you further down to the rabbit hole, or why not the Platonic cave. And this is also very parallel, of course, to other things mentioned before in Johnston's excellent book. That of speaking or thinking, we use words or images. I saw in front of me, or for my mind's eye, a beautiful meadow, and it was an angel flying around. That is not the memory. That's a way of expressing the memory for others. You in context within a specific situation or purpose of understanding, maybe doing, compared to Martin Luther King. I have a dream. Yeah, it's to invigorate the masses, to rejoice, to make them want, make them brave. What thinking is? Well, it's something other. It has its own rules. And what it is can never be related to how we talk about it. And that's a clue and a half. Because they have different purposes. They are different life words. And it also goes for memory as well. What memory is something different from the experience. Very hard to think about these things as unrelated. They must come together doesn't mean relation, or rather it doesn't mean causation. As we find on page 88, the thought is not a germ or a seed that develops into something else, an action or the like. By going into the mud or being in the quicksand, we very soon start looking for causation, at least especially in these modern days when we are incessantly in technology looking for origins, causes, where you almost always can find one. But that does not mean it can apply to the human mind. And there is the very problematic thing that Freud does, is in the very height of admiration of science as a technology of machines, and expand that into human beings. So in the same way you build a machine for a certain purpose, for instance a vacuum cleaner, and the subconscious of the vacuum cleaner could be that it takes away dust, its intention, which is its intention by the constructor. But human beings don't have that game, so to speak. It's a transferal, and in a way one of the problems or advantages is it's a different game. It will have its own truth values. So seeing the world that way is not intrinsically wrong. It's a confusion, yes, but that will lead to the result of a new language game, unrelated to how human beings function or are. So probably these language games will be played as the language game my brain feels full plays other rules than your actual brain, your innerness or your intentions or whatever. It still can be used, but do not confound it with something that is inside of you, the brain inside the skull, which originates all thoughts, all thinking, the seat of your experiences. In a way, the language games are imagining a big park with loads of children, and they conglomerate in groups. Each group will play by their own rules, even if there is a group exactly in the same spot, but very close, dressed the same way, looking the same way. They might be related, having a uniform. Still, the rules will be absolutely different. Especially to think of when they often in children's play evolve directly at that spot. And a clumsy observer, not too clumsy, but that's easily done, say that all children, they all look the same. All these games are related. They are caused by something, innerness. It's not very likely how that would evolve quickly. If you had maybe chaos theory, 5 children playing maybe with some pieces of Lego and somebody's turning around, soon will evolve completely different from even how it started. And in the other group next to it, you have quite another development. It happens quick, and it's also easy to make the false assumption that they have sameness. I think it's handy that Johnston and Wittgenstein also provides us with an understanding how these misunderstandings, confusions, misconceptions from the beginning came about. I think that is as important as looking deeply into them. Because in the same moment you realize, of course, it's almost inevitable to assume that from the beginning that what was assumed, but they are actually, when looking very closely, being extremely careful, you all of a sudden realize, oh, they are completely different in every aspect. And I just assumed too quickly that they were the same. And that stuck, and from that confusion I progressed my thinking. Then after that I was never able to regain the original curiosity to question it, which takes quite some effort. Whether I think to terminate that. Thank you very much, and until next